Some materials just define an era. Bronze, iron, steel. But in our time, there's a metal, one that most people never see, that underpins industrial power and military might like nothing else. This is the story of tungsten, the war metal. So let's be really clear about who said that. It's not a scientist. It's not a miner. It's a military official. And that, right there, tells you everything you need to know. Tungsten isn't treated like a simple commodity. It's a core strategic asset. It's the foundation of a nation's power and its ability to fight. But here's the thing. When you rely on just one source for something you absolutely need, that's a huge vulnerability. And in our scenario, set in 2025, that vulnerability gets exploited. The global supply chain wasn't just disrupted by accident. It was deliberately turned into a weapon. And that kicked off a crisis that rippled through defense, technology, and energy. The real question isn't if this could happen, but how. To really get the impact, just look at the price of what's called ammonium paratungstate, or APT. Just think of it as the key ingredient, the step between raw ore and the final metal. As you can see here, its price didn't just go up, it absolutely exploded, a nearly 10-fold increase. A stable industrial material became a volatile weapon almost overnight. This wasn't a market swing, this was a geopolitical earthquake. Okay, so to understand why this price shock was so devastating, we've got to understand the metal itself. What makes tungsten so special? Why does it have this incredible strategic importance? Let's break down what it can do. It all starts with heat. At over 3,400 degrees Celsius, tungsten has the highest melting point of any metal on the planet. I mean, that's a level of thermal resistance that makes it pretty much essential. It's why you find it lining the throat of rocket nozzles and building the armor for future fusion reactors, places where most other materials would just, turn into gas. Second, there is its sheer weight. At 19.25 grams per cubic centimeter, it is one of the densest materials on Earth. On the battlefield, kinetic energy is all about mass and velocity. Now, you can always increase velocity with more propellant, but packing more mass into a tiny projectile, that's the real trick. Tungsten solves that problem, letting you focus a ridiculous amount of energy on a single, tiny point. And third, it's just so hard. On the Mohs scale, it's about a 9, second only to diamond. This is why over 60% of all tungsten gets turned into tungsten carbide, what they call the industrial tooth, the stuff they put on the tips of cutting tools, mining drills, and heavy-duty construction equipment. And this slide really puts that density into perspective. Tungsten is virtually identical to gold in its weight. But think about this. While gold is valuable because it's beautiful and inert, tungsten is valuable for the exact opposite reason, for its capacity to do physical work and physical violence. So imagine a bullet with the weight of gold but the hardness of a diamond. That right there is the whole idea behind a modern armor-piercing round. Which brings us right to its most dramatic use, modern warfare. This is where tungsten's unique combo of density and hardness turns it from a simple industrial tool into an absolute game-changer on the battlefield. We're talking about something called a kinetic energy penetrator. So inside of an explosion, you just fire a long, thin rod of tungsten alloy at hypersonic speed. Over 1,500 meters per second. At that velocity, its massive density and momentum let it tear straight through more than half a meter of solid steel armor. No explosives needed. It's just pure physics, weaponized. Now, the critical choice for designers of these weapons is the material. For decades, the main alternative to tungsten has been depleted uranium, or Du. Their densities are almost the same, but the trade-off is huge. Du is pyrophoric, meaning it can catch fire on impact, and it leaves behind radiological contamination. From a purely military view, both are devastating, but logistically and politically, tungsten offers the same punch without the toxic mess, making it the go-to for many modern militaries. So, what we have is an indispensable metal with no real substitutes for its most critical uses. And this brings us to the core of the 2025 crisis, the supply chain. Where does all this tungsten actually come from? This chart, it says it all, doesn't it? In 2024, a staggering 83% of all tungsten mined in the world came from a single country, China. This isn't just market dominance. It's a structural single point of failure for the entire global economy and for Western defense. This concentration of supply is basically the loaded gun at the center of our story. And in our 2025 scenario, that gun was fired. China used a series of clever administrative moves to slowly choke the global supply.
This wasn't some crude export ban that would trigger lawsuits. No, it was way more sophisticated. They required new licenses that were slow to get, and they funneled all exports through a handful of state-controlled companies. The result was the same as a ban. Exports dropped 40%, but they could deny they were doing anything. It became a tool of diplomacy, a lever to use in disputes with other nations. The age of treating strategic materials like any other product was officially over.
This supply shock forced a massive reckoning. Western nations suddenly cut off from a material they absolutely needed for national security, launched a frantic, coordinated response. The goal was simple: break the chokehold and build a new, secure supply chain from scratch. The response came together as a three-part strategy. First, stockpile. Build up strategic reserves to survive any immediate shocks. Second, diversify, a global push to fund and develop new mines in friendly countries to break the monopoly. And third, recycle. Create a circular economy to recover tungsten from industrial scrap, treating it like a permanent resource.
The stockpiling effort was huge. The U.S. launched Project Vault, a $12 billion initiative. Now, this wasn't just about buying metal. It was about buying time. A strategic reserve doesn't solve the long-term problem, but it gives you a buffer, some breathing room to get the rest of your strategy in motion without being held hostage.
The diversify step kicked off a global hunt. Money poured into restarting old mines and developing new ones in allied nations. Projects in South Korea, Australia, and even the first new U.S. tungsten mine in decades were all fast-tracked to build a parallel supply chain, one that wasn't dependent on China.
And finally, recycling. This has been a quiet revolution. Recycling scrap tungsten, especially from old industrial tools, now provides over 30% of the supply in the US and Europe. Not only does this make the supply chain more secure, it's also way more efficient. It uses up to 70% less energy than digging new ore out of the ground.
So, where does all this leave us? The crisis of 2025 has permanently changed the game. We're now entering a new era, one that's defined not by plenty, but by strategic scarcity and intense competition for this critical resource. This chart shows the fundamental long-term problem. Even with all the diversification and recycling, global supply growth is projected to be just a little bit behind demand growth. Now, that tiny gap, just 0.2%, might seem like nothing, but when it's compounded year after year, it creates a permanent, structural shortfall. This means the future is pretty much guaranteed to be one of scarcity, competition, and high prices. And that demand pressure isn't just from the military. The green energy transition needs it for things like solar panels and EVs. High-tech computing needs it for data centers and semiconductors. And looking way out to the future, nuclear fusion, tungsten is currently the only material we know of that can handle the intense heat at the exhaust point of a reactor like ITER. So you have four of humanity's most important sectors: defense, green energy, computing, and fusion, all fighting over the same limited resource. And this brings us right back to where we started. The story of tungsten reveals a new reality, that access to critical materials is now a key part of national power. In a world where the very building blocks of technology can be held back on purpose, the question we're left with is this: is technological superiority itself now for sale to the highest bidder?